Deutsche Bank in London, in the UK. He is originally from Uganda, or has Ugandan nationality, has grown up in Swaziland. And Charles, have you studied in the UK, or have you studied elsewhere?
That's right. Yes, I studied in Uganda for undergraduate, then I studied a postgraduate in the UK.
Ah,
so
yeah.
Been all over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you've been working in London for how long?
So I've been working in London for about 14 and a half years now.
14 and a half, okay. Yeah. There you go.
So we're very pleased to have you with us, Charles.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for doing this today with us. So then we should hand over. I think you'll be speaking for 15 minutes or so.
Yeah.
And then as usual, have a discussion.
Yeah.
So over to you.
Well, thank you, Birgit, and thank you, Odile, for the warm welcome. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to you today. And I'm speaking on the topic of foolproof investment. And my aim is to share perspectives from Luke's Gospel, which is one of the eyewitness records of Jesus's life and teaching. I've also put something in the chat room if you like to have a handout to follow, but you don't need to use it. And because I'll be sharing a few snippets on the screen as well. So we're talking about a foolproof investment. To start us off, I thought it's worth asking the question, how good an investor are you? How good an investor are you? You might rank yourself a few notches below Warren Buffett, or maybe you might just rank yourselves a few notches above your grandmother, or you might not think you're an investor at all. The heart of the question really is, how well do we use our money? Now, from an everyday perspective, for most of us, if we find a bargain in the sales, we're excited about it. Or if we bought property before the prices went up, we get excited about it. Or if we negotiated a good price with our car dealer, we think we've done a good job. We like to celebrate financial success. Maybe if you bought gold before the financial crisis of 2008, you'd want to tell everybody how astute an investor you are, how you spotted the crisis and managed to take a safe investment. Or maybe if you invested in hand sanitizer last February, just before the coronavirus crisis came up, you might think yourself a smart investor. Or maybe you just got a better pay package at work. All of us have money at the heart of our thinking and our planning in our lives. Now, in Jesus's teaching that we're focusing on today, Jesus challenges his first century audience about money. And I think that we will find just the same challenge to our culture and our culture's thinking as well. So please do allow me to read for you from Luke's Gospel. I'll be reading from chapter 12, and hopefully something should come up on your screen shortly. I'll read from chapter 12 and verse 1. And then I will skip to verse 13 quickly. So in the meantime, when so many thousands of the people had gathered together that they were trampling on one another, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." And he told them a parable saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops." Then he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. So it's a pretty sobering message, isn't it? And at first reading, we might think, this is just for the super rich with excess possessions. But looking at Jesus's audience, we cannot think that. We're told in verse 1 that his audience is a crowd A few thousand people have gathered and they are trampling over one another. I think we all know that rich people don't trample over one another. And also it doesn't take rocket science to know that there aren't so many rich people in any society. So Jesus is addressing the average man and woman. The message we are dealing with today is more contemporary than we might think. It cuts across all echelons of society, and it is closer to each and every one of us than we might initially think. In our passage, we have two investors. Let's look at investor number one in verse 13. He has been badly treated by his brother. His brother has been stingy with the inheritance. So the man turns to Jesus for help. It's a common problem. And I bet if I asked anyone on this call, if you know of any family trouble because of an inheritance left behind, we might all put up our hand. And maybe even if it's not in our own immediate family, we've probably heard of stories, the battles about the piano, the battle about the car, the house, the farm, and maybe even battles about the cutlery. And where I come from in Uganda, when a wealthy relative dies, all of a sudden you have visits from aunties and uncles and distant cousins whom you have never met. And I once heard somebody say that where there is a will, there is a family. And so the challenge to investor number one is right up our street. It's in every family. He wants capital, maybe to invest for his pension, maybe to start a new business, maybe to save school fees for his children. So he asks Jesus to intervene. And in response, Jesus gives a warning. He says to the crowd, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not constitute in the abundance of his possessions. So that's investor number one. Let's look at investor number two. Jesus then tells the story of a rich man whose land has produced a harvest. It's another contemporary issue for all of us. The equivalent maybe is the investment manager or the private banker who's landed himself a good job. He's working in a team with a partner who figured out that the coronavirus crisis would unleash trouble on the airline industry in Europe. So they took a short position and they laughed their way through the summer of 2020 whilst everyone struggled. At the end of the year, they'd made lots of profit and he got a huge bonus. So you imagine him saying to his wife or her saying to her husband, darling, I think we should pay down the mortgage. Maybe we should spread out our investments, diversify into certain portfolios, retire early, buy a villa near the sea. And his wife or husband agrees and says, yes, you've worked hard. It's about time you spent more time with the family. We've always wanted to travel to East Asia. Let's quit the hassle of the daily commute. Let's relax, let's eat, let's drink, be merry. It's logical, right? The rich man in our story, I assume he's a farmer. He's got a bigger harvest than he expects, and he thinks, what shall I do? So he acts logically like a shrewd investor. He won't flood the market with his crops lest he gets killed on the price. So he thinks, okay, I'll build bigger barns so that I can manage the supply and I can manage the price for a long period of time. So he is set for life. It's normal, it's logical, it's shrewd. Any one of us, if we would want to do that, if we were good investors. In fact, many of us today in our society will aspire to be like this investor. For example, maybe the equivalent is a Deutsche banker who retired at 45. We might all say how smart, how shrewd that he managed to retire that early. But God's verdict, 2 words, you fool. Imagine that. Imagine you went to his funeral, the Deutsche banker. Everybody is praising him, how smart he was, how a shrewd investor he was. But on his tombstone, etched by God, herein lies Deutsche banker, a fool. He's not wicked. Maybe he was decent. Maybe he paid his taxes. He's not a fraudster. He followed all the compliance rules. There's nothing in our story to suggest that he cheated anyone. Maybe he was good to his family. Maybe he was respected by his colleagues. Maybe he was even an example for others. He's not wicked. He's not evil, but he's a fool. It's such a piercing verdict from God, and particularly for a culture like ours, where we praise intellectual ability. I suppose that in our culture, many of us might prefer to be called wicked than to be called a fool or an idiot. So God's verdict is ever more piercing for us today. And Jesus says, so it is for everyone who stores up riches for himself but is not rich towards God. Why? Why such a strong verdict? Two things our investor got wrong. First, he assumed he was invincible. And second, he assumed he was not accountable. So he thought, what shall I do? I'll build bigger barns. I'll store my grain. I'll pay off the mortgage. I'll rebalance my pension. I'll invest in gold. I'll buy a villa in Portugal by the sea, and I'll be set for life. It's sensible on one hand, but one thing is missing. He makes no provision for death. And God says to him, this night, your soul is required of you. So as he sits down in his villa with a red glass of wine, watching the sunset, thinking, I've done it. I've retired early. Suddenly, his chest tightens. He's got shortness of breath. He reaches out for the phone to call his wife, stretches for the table and falls off his chair, and he's dead. Or maybe he catches COVID. 2 weeks later, he's in hospital on a ventilator. And then his parents get that unhelpful phone call. I'm sorry to tell you, sir, or I'm sorry to tell you, ma'am, about your son or your daughter. You see, death is not far from all of us. Just last year in March, Tim Ineos, sporting director, died aged 40, fit as a fiddle. He rode for Team Sky at some point in the Tour de France. And if any of you love cycling as much as I do, you will know that in order to ride in the Tour de France, you've got to be super fit. But at age 40, he died of a heart attack. Death is not too far from us. Now, one might easily say, religion scares us to think about life after death with no evidence. Please do ask a question about that maybe later in the Q&A, but we can't go through that in detail now. But error number one that this man made, he assumed he was invincible, and God's verdict is 2 words, or 1 word, fool. This night, your soul is required of you, not tomorrow, no time to get your affairs in order, this night. The second mistake he made was he thought he was not accountable. He thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns. I will store my grain, my goods. And I will say to my soul, you have ample goods. I, my, my crops, my barns, my grain, my goods, my soul. He has made no consideration of God's provision, nor does he acknowledge God. Yes, on the one hand, his crop required him to sow, to work hard, to water, to weed, maybe even to fertilize. But any farmer knows that he's not able to enter the soil and make the crops grow. He doesn't control crop diseases. He doesn't make the sun shine or the rain fall. He didn't even put the land there. But in his success, he thinks there is no one to be accountable to, and he can do whatever he wants. His wealth will fix every problem. And then ultimately he says to his soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. And here therein exposes the heart of the problem. He thinks that the chief aim of his existence is to satisfy his physical needs. What did he think his soul could do with goods? Could he feed his soul with steak or with wine? And God's verdict, this night your soul will be demanded of you. And the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? His soul is taken by force. He has no say in the matter. It is taken by surprise. He has no say on the timing. You fool. So what does it mean for us today in 21st century Europe? It's so easy for us for money to make a fool of us in the same way. And so is the answer maybe to give away all our money to the poor? Maybe, but I don't think that's the main point of this story immediately. We need to look out for the real fool in the passage and make sure not to be like him. For you see, the man in the parable is not a real fool. He doesn't exist. It's a story Jesus tells to illustrate a point. The man who is the real fool in the passage actually is the man, our investor number one, the one who has been cheated of his inheritance. Now, we won't immediately think he's a fool. We think he's a victim, but we have to understand the context to understand why Jesus exposes him in this way. I want to just share a little bit of a few more verses just to give you a sense for the context. So we were told in verse 1 that a crowd has gathered, so many thousands of people. And Jesus is teaching them. He's saying, beware. He's warning them. Nothing is covered up that will not be revealed. So there is a time of exposing that is coming. He said that whatever you've said in the dark will be heard in the light. He said, do not fear those who kill the body, but fear him who after he has killed has authority to cast into hell. Yes, fear him. He says, everyone who acknowledges me before the Son of Man, or before men, the Son of Man, I himself will also acknowledge before the angels of God. So Jesus is teaching about judgment, eternity, death, heaven or hell. And then someone in the crowd, of all the thousands who are there, somebody in the crowd is lucky enough to be very close to Jesus to ask a question. One person gets a chance, and the thing he asks for is things. Teacher, tell my brother to share the inheritance with me. Jesus is warning about judgment, and this man is asking about perishables. There's always one guy in the crowd, and I don't know whether you had that kind of guy in your high school who would always ask a question that was sort of off topic. Instead of heeding the warning about eternity, he won't take his mind off his brother who won't share the inheritance, thinking only about this life. And God's verdict to him from the story, you fool. And then Jesus says, so it is for the one who stores up riches for himself and is not rich towards God. It's a pretty serious challenge from Jesus to our culture. It's a pretty strong rebuke. And I was a bit nervous to speak on this passage, but then I thought, in a city like London or in Luxembourg, this risk is very close to all of us. And so to the question we posed at the beginning, how good an investor are you? Maybe the question is, have we invested in the one thing that will last for eternity? Let's not let money make a fool of us, for we are not immortal and we will be accountable. Get rich towards God. That is the foolproof investment. Please do allow me to ask for God's help to help us apply this and to understand it. Our Father, we do thank you for helping us to think about how to invest for eternity. Please do give us the grace to see our folly where we may have it, and the grace to heed your warning so that we would seek to be rich towards God. And we ask this through Jesus Christ. Amen.